Be aware of people who believe in God, because they have a God who forgives them everything. I have heard this common statement more than once from different people. I don't entirely agree with this phrase, but it seems like the right fit to describe today's story. 22-year-old Scott Coville and 20-year-old Jane Lim met in 1984 when they entered the same Lacey College in Riverside, California. Scott was studying to become a biologist, while Jane was majoring in physical therapy. At first, Scott and Jane communicated only as friends, but after a couple of months, a romantic relationship began between them. From the very beginning, their romance was stormy. The couple often argued and made up. Sometimes they even sorted things out in public. Their friends knew not to take the couple's arguments too seriously. At the end of their first year, Scott dropped out of college and moved from California to Alaska, where he started working as a fisherman. Jane continued her studies because she didn't want to give up her dream of becoming a physiotherapist and helping people. Despite the distance, Scott and Jane continued their relationship. They called each other on the phone and wrote letters, and they practically did not quarrel while apart. It seemed their relationship had improved. 2 years later, in 1987, Jane graduated. At her graduation, Scott came to California to support her. Immediately after she received her diploma, Scott proposed to her and asked her to move to Alaska with him. Jane happily agreed, without hesitation. She packed her things, and with her lover she flew to Sitka, Alaska. Sitka is located on Baranof Island in the Alexander Archipelago of Alaska. Before the United States purchased Alaska in 1867, the city was known as Novoarkhangelsk and served as the capital of Russian America. The population of Sitka is about 9,000 people. Many people regularly come to Sitka to earn money through professional hunting and fishing. The area spans 12,500 square kilometers, but 99% of the area is mountainous and covered by taiga forests, with waters from the Gulf of Alaska surrounding it. In the summer of 1987, Jane moved from sunny California, with its dry summers and rainy winters, to Alaska. In Sitka, the summers are cool and the winters are mild but with high rainfall. At the time, Scott Coville had already changed jobs several times. He worked as a fisherman at a large cannery, part-time at a pulp mill, and occasionally did commercial fishing. The couple lived in a small, equipped trailer on the outskirts of Sitka. Jane focused on housekeeping and taking care of their home. However, the girls in the new city had no friends at all, and Scott was often away at work, returning home only late in the evening. After a couple of months, Jane began to argue with Scott again. Their gloomy mood was worsened by the surrounding nature. The constant rain, dampness, and overcast skies darkened the city. The mountains and forests that surrounded the area added to the sense of isolation, and Jane struggled to adjust to this new life in a much darker and colder place. However, despite all the difficulties, in October 1987, 25-year-old Scott and 23-year-old Jane officially married in Alaska. 4 months later, in February 1988, they arrived in San Diego, California to visit Scott's parents and held a magnificent wedding celebration for relatives. After the celebration, the newlyweds returned to Alaska, where almost immediately they encountered their first difficulties due to their own mistakes. Scott lost his job at the cannery after his boss caught him smoking at work. The young family was left completely without money, and they began to quarrel over trivial matters. Jane was constantly angry with her husband. She didn't know how to cope with life so far from home and loved ones in a cold, damp city. In March 1988, Jane called Scott's mother, Rita, and complained, saying, "I thought I would be happy, but marriage is very difficult." Rita, a wise, experienced woman, offered advice to her daughter-in-law. Marriage is a compromise, and in order to maintain a relationship, both people need to put in a lot of effort. Scott wasn't very close to his mother, but he did call her about once a week. His father, however, never complained about life. Rita, though, could sense that there were problems in her son's marriage. She believed Scott had rushed into the marriage too soon and feared that the constant arguments would lead to divorce. At the time, She couldn't have imagined how terrible the end of her beloved son's marriage would be. On April 12, 1988, Scott's mother, Rita Coville, called her son to wish him a happy 26th birthday. However, Scott did not answer the phone. Rita knew that her son worked a lot and was often away from home, so she didn't think much of it. However, as the days passed and her calls went unanswered, Rita became increasingly concerned. She knew that Scott had rarely communicated with anyone for a while, and in early May Rita dialed her son's number again, only to hear that the number had been disconnected. At this point, Rita decided that she needed to urgently find Scott. The parents reached out to all of Scott's friends in California. They discovered that Scott hadn't communicated with anyone for about a month. In Alaska, Scott had practically no friends. The workers at his job constantly changed, as people would come for 2-3 months to earn money and then return home. The parents were uncertain of what to think. Eventually they speculated that perhaps Scott had run away from his wife and was hiding in another city. They didn't want to consider the possibility that something terrible had happened to their son. Almost a month after Scott's disappearance, on May 8, Mother's Day, Rita received a beautiful card signed, "With love, Jane and Scott." The signature was written in Jane's handwriting and the envelope was postmarked San Bernardino, California. The parents thought that perhaps their son was visiting Jane's relatives in California, but they found it odd that Scott, who was already rarely at home, had not mentioned this and had not tried to meet with them. Jane's family lived only a couple of hours' drive from Scott's parents, so this seemed strange. 3 weeks later, on May 30th, Scott's parents, still unsure of their son's whereabouts, decided to call the police in Sitka, Alaska. Rita spoke to the officers, expressing her concern that Scott could have left the house on his own, but she was very worried since no one knew where he was, and she wanted to find him. The police began a slow investigation into the young man's disappearance. A week later, on June 8th, law enforcement published an article in the newspaper with a photograph of the missing 26-year-old Scott Coville, but this did not produce any leads. No one called in with information and no one responded to the newspaper notice. The police then visited the trailer where Scott and Jane had lived. Jane's things were gone, but Scott's belongings were still in place. Inside the mobile home, everything was clean and orderly, with nothing appearing out of the ordinary. Authorities found no clues that would indicate where Scott had gone. In her hometown of San Bernardino, California, but she could not be located. Eventually, the police found Scott's empty truck in the parking lot at Sitka Airport. However, it turned out that Scott had not bought any plane tickets, nor had he flown anywhere, at least not under his own name. As an adult, Scott had the legal right to disappear, and law enforcement did not consider themselves obligated to continue the search. Perhaps Scott bought a plane ticket using fake documents and flew to a place where no one knew him, but he couldn't be found. At the end of the summer, Scott's parents received another letter, this time only from Jane. The text, written on 3 pages, was completely incoherent. Jane wrote that her husband Scott had packed his things and left home. She didn't know where he had gone or with whom. She mentioned that he had not contacted her and in the letter claimed that Scott had been using illegal substances. According to Jane, it was because of these substances that bad thoughts had started to form in his mind, which led him to decide to run away and seek a better life. At the end of the letter, Jane included her new phone number so that Scott's parents could contact her if necessary. The investigation into Scott Coville's disappearance reached a dead end. He was neither found alive nor dead. 6 years later, in 1994, his parents declared their beloved son dead. Scott's mother, Rita Coville, admitted that all these years she had only hated one person, her daughter-in-law Jane. For all this time, Rita had wished death upon Jane and blamed her for taking her only son away forever. Over the years, Jane moved to Southern California, found work as a physical therapist, and became actively involved in the local Seventh-day Adventist Church, an international Protestant organization. Jane donated large amounts of money to the church and even took part in missionary work in Nepal and China. At the age of 35, Jane met a new man named Chris Redd, who worked as a corporate jet pilot. After a year of dating in 2000, The couple got married in a church ceremony. Jane moved with her husband to the suburbs of Chicago, where she found work in her specialty. She was well loved by her new neighbors and colleagues. However, 5 years later, Jane's second marriage ended in failure. In 2005, the couple separated and began divorce proceedings. Chris moved back to California while Jane stayed in Illinois. 2 years later, in 2007, Chris Redd filed a request for annulment of his marriage to Jane with the Roman Catholic Church. The church took this matter seriously and hired a detective to investigate the background of the spouses, Chris and Jane. During a conversation with the detective, Chris immediately confessed that Jane had admitted to him that she was responsible for the death of her first husband, Scott Coville, and that no one had caught her or punished her. The detective, having received this information, contacted the police department in Sitka, Alaska, and learned that Scott's disappearance, which had occurred nearly 20 years ago, was still unsolved. The detective passed on the information he had learned from Chris to the Sitka police. They asked Chris to call Jane again, talk to her about Scott's murder, and record the conversation. Chris agreed to do as the police requested. He was able to record a telephone conversation with his ex-wife, Jane, in which she once again confessed to him that she had murdered her first husband. This was a significant breakthrough in the case, but the audio recording alone wasn't enough to arrest or convict Jane. There was still no concrete evidence that Scott had been killed because his body had never been found. Detectives revisited the trailer where Scott and Jane had lived 20 years ago. This time they worked professionally and thoroughly. Under the carpet in the main bedroom, they found a large, dark stain on the floor. After testing it, they confirmed that the stain was blood. But what could be compared to this blood sample after 20 years? Fortunately, Scott's mother, Rita Coville, had kept her son's baby teeth, which had been removed by the dentist when Scott was a child. Forensic scientists compared the DNA from the baby teeth with the DNA found in the blood stain in the trailer. The results were a perfect match. 22 years after Scott's disappearance, he was finally found, though not alive. Jane was charged with murder. She was arrested on January 13, 2010, at the age of 46. At the time, she was living a calm, measured life in Asway, New York. She worked and was still devoted to her church, where she helped people with developmental disabilities. Her neighbors were shocked when they saw her being handcuffed and taken away by the police. No one had any idea of the dark secret she had been hiding all these years. During interrogation, Jane denied her involvement in Scott's disappearance. However, when presented with the audio recordings and the photographs of blood traces found in their old trailer, Jane confessed everything. She explained that on April 12, 1988, on Scott's 26th birthday, the couple had been lying in bed talking. At some point, Scott admitted that he was tired of the marriage and wanted a divorce. This angered Jane, and when Scott fell asleep, she took out a Magnum revolver and shot him while he was still in bed. His death was instant, but the horror didn't stop there. Jane then took an axe with a long handle and, while still in the bedroom, dismembered her husband's body. She placed the pieces in black garbage bags, scattered them in various trash cans around town, and later it was disposed at a factory that burned all the garbage, making it impossible to recover the body. Afterward, Jane returned to the trailer, erased all traces of her crime, and packed her personal belongings. She took Scott's truck, drove to Sitka Airport, abandoned the vehicle in the parking lot, and flew to California to stay with her parents. She lied to her relatives, friends, and everyone around her, saying that Scott had run away and that she didn't know where he was. She complained that her family life, which she had once hoped would be like a fairy tale, had turned out to be a nightmare. Soon the trial began. Jane faced up to 70 years in prison. She avoided initial charges of first-degree murder and tampering with evidence by agreeing to a plea deal for second-degree murder. During the trial, Jane again told the story of what happened that terrible night. She stated that in 1988 she had been too young and inexperienced, only 24 years old at the time. She admitted that she and Scott often argued and that Scott had been physically abusive toward her. She claimed she didn't know where to turn for help in such a foreign city. However, no evidence of domestic violence was found in the couple's relationship. The prosecutor argued that no matter how brutal someone might be, not everyone is capable of such atrocities as Jane had committed. The prosecutor described Jane as calculating and heartless. She had rid herself of her husband in the most horrific way, lying to her loved ones, writing letters to Scott's parents pretending to be him, and even accusing her husband of using substances. Jane claimed it was these substances that had caused Scott to run away from home. Scott's mother, Rita Coville, spoke in court, stating that her son had never been dependent on psychoactive substances. He rarely drank alcohol and smoked only occasionally. Rita admitted that her relationship with Scott was not particularly close. He never confided in her about problems in his marriage and answered her questions slowly, often taking time to think through his responses. He never complained to her about his troubles, but she sensed that something was wrong. She knew her son was unhappy in the marriage and wanted a divorce from Jane. Jane's lawyer argued that the defendant should be sentenced to 15 years in prison, given that she had confessed to her crime. Over the 22 years since Scott's disappearance, Jane had tried to atone for her actions. She had done good deeds, helped the needy, and participated in missionary work abroad for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. One of Jane's colleagues testifying in court described her as very caring and responsive, someone who made charitable donations and never refused to help others. These were Jane's final words in court. "I don't know what I can do now to correct what I did 20 years ago. I know that I really regret what I did. I've thought about it for many years. I don't make excuses for myself. I am guilty, and I completely repent." The judge considered the cold and calculating manner in which Jane had acted. On March 3, 2011, she was found guilty and sentenced to a prison term of 25 to 55 years. She will be eligible for parole no earlier than January 2034, by which time she will be 70 years old. Scott's mother, Rita Coville, said that when she listened to Jane's confession in court, she felt nothing but indifference toward the woman. She had always known that Jane was responsible for her son's disappearance. For 10 years, Rita cursed Jane, but eventually she realized that it was pointless and began to feel indifference instead. Jane's mother, on the other hand, believed that wherever Jane went, God would punish her. For 22 years, Scott's mother lived in uncertainty, always feeling that her son was no longer alive. But she had always longed to know the truth, no matter how painful it was. Scott's father passed away in 2004, never knowing the truth about what happened to his son. Rita found it terrifying to think that her husband had lived for 16 years without ever knowing what had truly happened to their son. It was also heartbreaking for her to realize that she would never be able to bury her only son, who had been born and died on the same day. Share your thoughts about this story in the comments and don't forget to like this video. Thanks for watching.